So for those of you who are with us on Monday, you'll remember that we were welcoming a new year. We were welcoming in Rosh Hashanah, and we were slightly distracted by something on the Zoom, but that's fine. One of the things I noted as we were going through the evening was that this new year, in fact, was a Shemita year, a Sabbath year. So those of you who are familiar with the Torah and Leviticus and how the sort of the commands that God gives his people and how it shapes the nation of Israel, they are told that just as there is a Sabbath every week, 6 days you'll work and 1 day you'll rest, there's a Sabbath for the land every 7 years. So there's 6 years of reaping the harvest, and then 1 year where the land lies fallow, that all the private lands become open, and the food and the harvest is freely accessible to all. And we read this in Exodus 23, 10 to 12. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce. But the seventh year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and stranger may be refreshed. And it talks about that also later in Leviticus 25. And it culminates with, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, your male and your female servants, your hired servants, and the stranger who dwells with you. For your livestock and the beasts that are in your land, all its produce shall be for food. So it's this incredible picture, isn't it, of how for 6 years you had private land and private harvests, and people were enriching themselves in various different ways. But it comes to the seventh year and all the land becomes open for the poor, for the alien, for even for the wild animals. No one stops anything being eaten from anywhere. And that's an incredible picture of generosity. And if we look at the world around us, it's not the type of world we live in today. I was looking at a statistic that came up recently, and that's that 25% of all the wealth in the UK is owned by 1% of the population. So a quarter of all of our wealth as a nation is actually held by 1% of the population. And we live in a world that makes a heroes out of those people who are productive and wealthy and have good jobs and work hard, and all of that kind of thing is the picture and a mythology in our culture. If you think about the stories we tell and the heroes, they're the ones who start from nothing and end up with great wealth. You know, the term self-made millionaire or self-made man, all that sort of thing is almost a bit of a mythology. Someone who's able to go start with nothing and end up with great wealth. And if you look at two of those sorts of people in Bill Gates and Elon Musk, both of those guys are famous for dividing their days into 5-minute chunks so they can maximize their productivity. So they diary everything. Every 5 minutes has to produce something, and they're constantly on this treadmill of productivity and generating wealth. And we somehow kind of think that if someone's made their money, they're somehow morally better than if you've just inherited the money. Sort of inherited wealth is kind of sort of sneered at, whereas self-made money is sort of like, oh, well, you've pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and all of that kind of thing. But then if you look at these sorts of self-made people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and lots of them, they're hardly the sort of role models for followers of Jesus. They're often very lonely, very difficult people who treat their staff incredibly poorly. But all of that's forgiven because they're seen as these wealth-producing geniuses that can do things other people can't. And because that's the mythology of our day, then people will buy into that, allow for that. And if we look at this idea of like, even though these types of people are not people that we would see as sort of role models in the Christian church, the wealth of our nations in the West is actually being shaped on Christian principles. The reason why the West has the wealth that it has and has gone down the direction it's gone down is actually because of the church, and it's because of theologians in the church. Calvin and Luther, particularly during the Reformation, shaped this idea that what came to be known as the Protestant work ethic. So John Wesley sums it up as earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. So the idea is that you work hard and you earn lots of money, and then you then are able to then save money and give money out to other people. And that picture of wealth generation is then trickled out into the wider society, and it's actually become sort of a mantra for the whole of the West. And you can look over the course of history in the last few hundred years and see how nation after nation in this sort of European and then American context has gone about gathering wealth on that principle of working hard and earning. And it's sort of, when you think about it, that then comes right into our day-to-day lives, doesn't it? This idea of being busy and being productive. And I don't know how you feel about your day, but do you look back and think, how productive was I? Do you feel guilty if you sort of are lazing around the house for an hour or two with nothing going on, or are you actually very good at doing nothing? I often find myself in that situation where I'm trying to be busy and productive all the time, even though I'm not very good at it. And let's be honest, for the vast majority of us, we're never going to be millionaires, let alone billionaires. And a lot of us are busy and productive and doing all of those sorts of things because we're holding down jobs, because we're caring for families, because we're trying to keep a roof over our head in an increasingly expensive and overcrowded country. And Generation X are a great example of this. Who was born between 1965 and 1980? So I'm in that camp. Anyone else? So there's a lot of people. So 65 to 1980. So that generation, Generation X, they typically earn more than any generation before them. So this is the wealthiest generation. And yet they have more debt than has ever been held by any previous generation. And that greater wealth and the greater debt has actually brought greater pressures and less time. So many of this Generation X, ironically, feel less satisfied with their lot than the generations before them. So that generation, despite being the wealthiest on record, is also the sort of the least satisfied with the wealth that they've accumulated. And actually gathering up huge amounts of wealth, having all of this pressure and all of this busyness isn't actually fulfilling in the end. And it's interesting to look at millennials, who are the generation after them, and see quite a big rejection of that status quo, with lots of them running off into the woods to do some forest bathing and becoming yoga instructors. And, you know, that kind of sort of, instead of it being assets that you try and hold on to, it's experiences. So that generation, millennials, are very much experiential. They're trying to get these amazing experiences. I traveled here, I did this, I did that, rather than have money in the bank. So they're less likely to save for the future. They're more likely to spend it now and enjoy it. And now, none of this is to say that work is bad. I know it says in Genesis 3 that we, through the curse, we eat bread by the sweat of our brows. Now, it's the sweat that indicates the broken relationship, not the work. And we've kind of lumped the two together. We kind of have this idea that if we can escape work and have a life of leisure and ease, then actually suddenly we're somehow have made it and become happy. And lots of people work incredibly hard to save up for retirement or play the lottery, hoping that they can get rid of this need to work and suddenly live a life of leisure. But actually, again, another study I read recently says that people with too much leisure time are actually more unhappy with people with a medium amount of leisure time. And that's because work gives us purpose. And actually, if we look at the Bible, we see God is a worker God. He is someone who works for 6 days creating the earth and then rests for 1 day. From the very beginning, we see God at work, and he welcomes us into that whole picture with instituting the Sabbath. He commands us not to just rest on the seventh day, but actually work on the 6 previous. So there's this picture that work is good if there's, if, and this is the big caveat, work is good if it's in line with God's will. So God is a worker God. He calls us to work alongside him, to work for the kingdom of God. And that is the fulfilling work that God is asking us to do. So not all work is godly work, and it's understanding what is in God's will and what is his call on us and what is he gifted us to. And those can be all of the normal jobs that we do. So for me, I work in a sort of a ministry context. That's my job. But my wife works in a secular context, and both of us feel very called to the work that we do. And it's not sort of if you work in a ministry context, you're somehow got a better calling than if you don't. Actually, we need godly people in the workplace in every sphere. So it's that sense of, and it's also working for everything as if you're working for the Lord. When Paul gives that kind of advice, he's actually giving it to bondservants, basically indentured slaves, and saying, look, I know you're stuck, but it doesn't matter. Work as if you're working for the Lord. You know, that's an incredible statement if you think about it. And also, you know, we see Daniel as a great example of someone who is working in the kingdoms of this world. So he's working in Babylon and all of the Babylon system and all of that, what that means. And yet he is maintaining his dedication to God, and he is thriving. It's interesting actually that he keeps his dietary, he's strict on his dietary observance, and also his praying 3 times a day. But he is able to, through this lifestyle, actually maintain that commitment and connection to God, despite the fact that he's serving this Babylonian system. And Jesus absolutely nails it when he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God's what is God's. I think, you know, I could have started and ended with that, because I think it's just that simple. Jesus really puts it so very, very clearly. You know, if it's the Queen's head on there, then actually give it to the tax man. But then actually, if it's a godly thing of prayer and committing our whole lives to him, well, then that is what we need to be giving to God. And it's a simple separation of those two things. Now, I started by saying that we are entering into this 7th year Sabbath year. So as we enter into this, you might be thinking to yourself, well, how does this affect things in Israel? Well, interestingly, it was ignored for many, many centuries simply because it didn't have to be done by the Jewish people because they weren't living in Israel. So their argument was, well, we're not in Israel, so we don't have to keep the Sabbath. So now they've moved back in. It makes things a little bit complicated. And unfortunately, even though the Sabbath year is celebrated, the Jubilee year is not. So again, those of you who know your Torah will know that after 7 7-year cycles, then the 50th year is a Jubilee year, which has further, even greater commandments that talk about cancelling all debts. So anybody who owes anybody any money on the 50th year is released entirely from all financial obligations. And also, not only that, but the land itself returns to those who God gave it to as an inheritance to begin with. So there's a complete reset in the whole of the whole of Israel, as everything goes back to its original owners and all debts are completely released. And in Leviticus 25, it sort of sums it up when it says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And it's a beautiful picture of how in God's kingdom, we are valued for who we are as his children, not for our productivity. We're not valued or rated by what we're able to produce, or what wealth we have, or what we own, or what our parents own and gave to us. It is only on our identity as being a member of his kingdom and his community. And that's how it was on that 50th year in Israel. So in closing, I just want to sum up and say, should we be looking at a Torah-based economy where all debts are released every 50th year? Or should we be looking at a church, Protestant-based economy, which is work and work and work and work and work? And I'm going to leave that to you to think about and to decide upon. But it's a beautiful picture from Scripture, isn't it? It helps us to think and say, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to live? What's this really mean to us? Do we really buy into the way the world is today? Or actually, as Jesus did, are we being quite countercultural with the surrounding around us? In fact, it's an interesting way of looking at who the church is. The ways in which the church help the poor, particularly around stuff around COVID and things like that, getting out food banks, getting out knocking on doors, helping people. Do you need a hand? What do you need? Is actually very reminiscent of the Jewish community, which has a very big picture of charity and raises huge amounts of money all the time to look after poor and needy Jewish people. And I think that's a really good picture for us in God's kingdom. And it's also what we do with our wealth is an indicator of where our hearts are. Jesus again put it very succinctly in Matthew 6 when he said, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. So mammon in this case is sort of wealth. Now I'm going to use two very old-fashioned words, which I'm sure everybody will understand, but it seems very old-fashioned to talk about thrift and to talk about charity. So in the old King James, going back a bit now, agape love is translated as charity. And it's what we get our charity commission and charitable works and all of that idea from, this idea of altruistic giving. And these are often the sort of forgotten partners of this Protestant work ethic that we all hear the earn all you can. We might hear a bit of the save all you can. Well, that makes sense, saving for old age, etc. But do we hear the give all you can as well? No, I'm sure I missed that bit at the end. And it's really challenging to think, where are we at with thrift and charity? And particularly, how about a story where the hero starts off rich and actually gives all his money away and becomes poor? Would we see them as a hero, as giving away all their wealth? This is the challenge that Jesus gives the rich man. Are you able to do it? Where's your heart? Are you able to give all this wealth away and start again? I mean, we can't take it with us. He's promising treasure in heaven, isn't he? And that's hugely, hugely challenging, to see someone who's willing to give their wealth away as actually the hero rather than someone who starts with nothing and builds it up. And I think it's in our sort of consumer-driven age where people will spend lots of money on lots of things around entertainment and enjoyment and all of that kind of stuff. The idea of living within your means and saving well so that we can give is actually a good sort of antidote to the world in which we live in. And consuming less is good for our waistlines. We could all probably consume less food. We could also think about how consuming less is actually good for creation, in the sense of, are we burning through a lot of resources that we don't actually need? And the other is it's good for our bank balances. And that idea of saying living with less, living with thrift and with charity is a real challenge, I think, to say where are our hearts really. So then we have to decide, because we can't have it all. I was very challenged by a sermon I heard a year or two ago where the speaker said, you can't have it all. You can't have intimacy with God and great wealth, in the sense of, if you think that you're the one person who can, maybe you are, but actually more likely than not, you're going to be in a situation where you have to choose. And putting God's first is the way that we will live in his kingdom. It says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, And I think that has to be our focus alone. And we see that in the Ten Commandments, that it's very clear: have no other God before the Lord. And God, because as Deuteronomy 4 tells us, the Lord your God is a consuming fire and a jealous God. And if we think that we can kid him or kid us, that we can sort of keep him on the back burner and bring him out on Sundays or high holy days or any of that kind of thing, that's not how it works. We don't get to have any other God before him. And actually making that choice and making that again and again and again as the challenge comes down through the years is the thing that keeps us close to him, and making sure that in all of these sort of challenges of life, we keep that right perspective.